This being our third summit, each year we have had a presentation on cybersecurity. Mayor Battle talked earlier about cyber being such an important topic in the economy of Huntsville and in every high-tech industry. And we see it every day in our industry, and I'm sure everybody here sees it because every individual can have a cyber attack, every business can have a cyber attack. We've had presentations each of our past 2 years on cyber. Matthew gave one 2 years ago. We had a cyber expert in last year. We have another one today. When we started our bank, as David was talking about earlier, you need partnerships. And one of the partnerships that we started 16 years ago now as we were starting our bank was with Maynard Cooper, law firm in Birmingham. And our next speaker, J.T. Malatesta, is a partner with Maynard Cooper. You can read through all of his credentials in your handout. I won't bore you with that, but just suffice it to say, he is truly an expert on the legal side of cybersecurity. He knows what he's doing. We've had occasion to deal with him recently, and he's been a tremendous resource for us. I know you're going to know after he gives this presentation just how knowledgeable he is, and he's really going to be a great asset to you after you hear what he has to say today. He can cover a lot of the different sides of cybersecurity, and what we found out is once you find yourselves on the wrong side of, it wasn't our breach, but something that happened indirectly to us, you find yourselves on the wrong side of a cybersecurity attack, you need legal advice on exactly what your next steps are. And JT is going to address that along with some other aspects on prevention and everything. So anyway, help me welcome JT. He drove up from Birmingham this morning. So.
Thanks, Mike, for that introduction. This is probably a first for me in that I'm 6'4" and I think I'm the shortest presenter today. But as Mike said, my name is J.T. Malatesta. I'm the chair of the cybersecurity and privacy practice at Maynard Cooper. I work out of our Birmingham, Alabama office. But over the years, we've now grown to actually have offices in California, New York, and Washington, D.C. And so we will service all of those areas. And today, my motivation and goal is not to scare you. It's to educate you about what I've seen in the marketplace from advising companies, both from a risk mitigation standpoint and also from a breach response standpoint, so that hopefully you leave here with some practical takeaways about what are the attacks that are seen in the industry, how could they impact our business, what are we doing well, and what could we be doing better to mitigate the financial exposure that a cybersecurity event could have on our business. And so what I have formulated over the years are 10 lessons from handling in excess of 100 data breaches. And what you learn quickly is that the cyber threat landscape is constantly evolving. And I'm going to walk through a couple of those examples. But if you try and look and say, okay, this impacted us in the past, so let's be ready to address this if it happens in the future, that is certainly one way to address data breaches. But the reality is that they constantly are evolving the schemes. So let's take ransomware as an example. Many of you may be familiar with ransomware, but it basically is an encryption mechanism so that if the cyber criminals can't steal your money, they're going to basically make your data and your business unavailable. And they make a demand for payment. And it's some type of extortion. And this is just one type of ransomware node. And I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of this discussion. I really just sort of want to talk through a variety of different circumstances and then talk through more from the business impact and the business response rather than the technical. But ransomware typically has a 72-hour demand. It can have less than that. It can have longer than that. But the nut of it is that it requires you to make a payment in order to restore your data so that it's operational. And really in those instances, it puts a premium on backups so that you have access to that data rather than having to pay the demand. And I'm going to speak through that scenario a little bit more in depth as we progress through the presentation. Phishing. I'm sure everyone in here recognizes phishing. It continues to be the most prevalent form and scheme in order to lead to an intrusion that ultimately leads to the exfiltration of data or the exfiltration of data that contains personal information. And again, I'm going to walk through that in a little bit more detail. Now, one campaign that we saw very common last year was what we call a W-2 spear phishing campaign. So for those of you that work in HR or those that work in finance, this is something to be particularly mindful of. And there's a blessing and curse to social media. 2 years ago, you might get a generic phishing campaign that says, "Dear John," and it's somewhat like this, where you can pretty quickly tell that it's a generic request. Then you can say, okay, that looks like phishing, I'm not going to click on it. Then we started seeing more advanced techniques, because in today's digital media, take me for example. You could run a Google search, you could look at my Facebook profile, you could look at my family's Facebook profile and realize he's married, he's got 4 kids, and rather than a Dear John or a Dear Klein email, it's Dear JT. They can figure out where my kids go to school. And they make it a much more personalized phishing attack so that you believe that it's coming from somebody you know. In this case, what they were doing is targeting personnel in HR departments. And they were creating the impression that the email was coming from a senior executive, perhaps the CFO, making a request for employees' W-2 forms. And the HR employee would think it's a legitimate request and send those requested PDFs to the recipient. And what we would then come to find out pretty quickly is that the individual was not the CFO, it was somebody spoofing the CFO. And that information now left the company. And what we came to find out is, on this particular breach that I'm referencing, the email was sent out with the W-2s at 10:30 on a Friday. By 4 o'clock that Friday, fraudulent tax returns were being filed with the IRS. So they're extremely quick. They already know who they want to target. They have other data elements on those individuals. They may have been able to purchase your social security number from the dark web. They may have compromised another attack. And then they have the final piece of information that allows them to commit the financial crime. Another point here. Another scam that we saw is tech support. Many of you at your home computer may see a pop-up that says you have an infection and you need to call this number. And lo and behold, you call the number and they are able to log into your local computer and they either exfiltrate information that's stored locally or they make a demand and say you've got an infection, which they proceeded to do while you were on the phone because they came in through a login session, and they make a demand for payment and say, well, this actually comes outside of your warranty, you need to make an additional payment of $100, $150, et cetera. So a lot of people fell victim to this, this scheme as opposed to actually looking to the actual authentic website and saying what's the right number to call. And so a lot of these things really aren't that complicated. It's just preying on that human weakness, that tendency to trust others or to believe that because of the information that's been presented, it is an authentic request. And then you get into the more complicated cyber intrusions. So if you take something like Equifax, where they exploited a vulnerability, that's where you have a more sophisticated attack. And in those instances, what's happening is they are identifying what technology can be exploited. So when you talk to cybersecurity experts, what they'll say is they're not targeting people, they're exploiting technology. They're targeting the technologies. So in this instance with Equifax, for example, they had identified a particular web application that had a vulnerability. And they targeted Equifax because they use that web application to host that service. And unfortunately, a lot of us outsource our technology relationships. We're dependent on those vendors. And they push patches, and those typically lag. So cyber criminals already have sort of a head start. They typically, on average, have 57 days to exploit a vulnerability before a patch is even released to the market. And then you're dependent on your IT team or your IT vendor to patch, and that may not happen the day it's released. So that's why we continue to see so many prolific attacks across industry. So, with all of these cybersecurity threats, this is not rocket science, but it surprises me how often people sit on issues before they sort of escalate them internally within an organization or get the support they need to address them. And what you find is that time really does matter. So, when I was talking through these sort of cybersecurity threats, at the end of the day, most of these threats are by cyber criminals who are looking for cold, hard cash. 75% of breaches are typically done by malicious actors. 25% are done by inside employees, what we call the insider threat. But financial gain is typically the motivation for the attack. So for each of you in the audience, what I want you to think through is what data do we have that can be monetized? Do we have payment cards? Do we take credit cards for payment for our services? Do we have W-2 forms, which almost all of you do? Is that a piece of information that can be monetized? For those in the medical community, it's going to obviously be your medical records so they can commit Medicare fraud. You've got to think through what is the asset that we have that would be valuable to an outsider. And when we're talking about financial harm, what we've seen particularly this year is a tremendous number of wire frauds. And what's occurring through a variety of different means is an intrusion into a company, and then there's a request made for a wire fraud. And in those instances, when you're talking about wire frauds, what you have to realize is that there's what we call as a 72-hour kill chain. And so in those instances, time really does matter. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has a mechanism to actually freeze a wire fraud that goes to an unauthorized recipient within the first 72 hours. After that period of time, the likelihood of recovery diminishes greatly. So if you do find yourselves in a problem where you've had that type of attack, understand that it is important to immediately escalate it within the organization and then consult law enforcement to see, is that an avenue for fraud recovery? If you're looking at it from the consumer perspective, we talked about customer experience and taking care of customers earlier today. From a consumer standpoint, if you put yourself in their shoes, if you knew that your credit card had been compromised, you'd want to know. You'd want to know sooner rather than later, because every day that goes by is an opportunity for that card to be used for financial transactions. You may get protection from your credit card company or from your bank, but at the end of the day, that's a hassle you don't want to have to deal with. It's an inconvenience. It's a concern. And so from a consumer standpoint, if your company has had a cyber attack, you want to make sure that you're able to take care of that customer. You don't want to exacerbate the problem by sitting on something you know and not disclosing it. From a regulatory perspective, for those of you who are in that type of industry, whether it's healthcare, finance, education, your regulator is going to expect you to communicate and disclose that issue sooner rather than later. And we'll speak through some of those timetables in today's presentation. But the regulator's primary focus is on protecting the customer and making sure the consumer is informed and has an opportunity to address the situation. Then you look at it from just a dollars and cents standpoint, from a corporate valuation standpoint. Our firm was commissioned to do a financial assessment of publicly traded breaches for a Fortune 500 company earlier this year. And we looked at all of the headline breaches you probably recognize: Home Depot, Target, Equifax, JP Morgan. And what we found is, in terms of the valuation of that company, if you look at just its market cap, a data breach can have a significant impact on the value of the company. And so when you look at the data breach and how it was handled by those organizations, what we found is that those companies that could disclose the breach within 1 week to their customers, stood a very better chance of recovering the value to the organization sooner rather than later. So if you look at Home Depot, its share price dipped, but within 7 days had recovered. If you look at Equifax, on the other hand, Equifax had the data breach that we all recognize. It impacted 148 million Americans. They took 6 weeks before they disclosed it to customers. Then they exacerbated the problem by extending credit monitoring through one of their subsidiaries, but that was contingent on waiving your class action rights. Then they posted a website for you to access to get information on whether your Social Security number had been compromised. The website didn't work, or in fact, there was a spoofed website where they were directing customers, and those customers now were getting double dipped in that they had a breach, and now they were being asked to submit their personal information, and it was to a wrong website. In that situation, to this day, they haven't recovered their share price. And so a good response is critical to restoring customer confidence. Yes, no one wants to find themselves on the wrong side of this issue. Nobody wants to have a cybersecurity incident. Practically speaking, it's bound to happen. And so one of the takeaways from these breaches has been time does matter. The response is incredibly important. All right. So train your employees. And I know this is a self-evident statement, but time and again, I really don't see the investment being made in the workforce to educate them about the risk. I'm sure all of us recognize phishing campaigns. I'm sure all of us recognize cybersecurity incidents, but you can really reinforce the issue to your employees so that they're aware. And what has been shown statistically is that individuals that are made aware of cybersecurity issues, and that can be presented through a variety of different formats. It can be lunch and learn sessions. It can be simulated phishing incidents. It can be training modules. But what is shown is that when employees are exposed to that education, they become less and less likely to click on a phishing link. They become less and less likely to send W-2s to an email address when they think it's an executive. And so there's some basic fundamental training that goes a long way in reducing the risk. There are a lot of great resources online now that have been published, whether it's the FTC or Ponemon or Verizon, and all of those studies say the same thing, that employees continue to click on phishing links. And time and again, if I looked at the breaches we've handled, I would say over 80% of them are the byproduct of an employee clicking a link or sending out an email to an individual that they thought was the right person, misconfiguring a web server, putting a laptop, using a laptop, it's not encrypted, they lose it at the airport. I mean, one interesting statistic is that there are 12,000 laptops lost at airports across this country every year. And these sort of very sort of basic experiences can really cause a lot of trouble to your organization. And this is more often than not the type of situation that we see that could be prevented just through some basic education and training. All right, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on security. This is not meant to be a tech talk. I recognize many of you may not be on the information side of the house, but I think everybody can pretty much understand these security measures. And I would say, and don't sort of take this verbatim, but if you put these processes into place, my prediction would be that you are significantly reducing your risk profile. And these are not heavy investments that you as a company need to make. Take passwords, password complexity, password rotation. What does that mean? Have a password that is 8 characters or more that requires a special character. Tell your employees not to put that on a Post-it note on their computer. Okay? In terms of rotation, make your employees change their password every fill-in-the-blank days. I would advise 60 days. Some people may say 90 days. Perhaps you want to be more aggressive. But if you continue to rotate that information, it makes it harder to get into the computer network. Time and again, you will hear regulators talk about how oftentimes the password that was compromised was literally the word password, okay? Don't make your password War Eagle or Roll Tide, right? Those are sort of obvious choices for people to use targeting someone in Alabama. When we do audits, we have done a number of risk assessments for companies. And when we look at their password history, what we find, and to me it continues to shock me, is that we will find 70% of the organization has had the exact same password the entire time they've been with a company. That makes it much easier to gain access into an environment, whereas if you're rotating it periodically. In terms of access controls, basic physical security, having codes at doors, locking up your servers, in terms of technical and administrative, think of it as what I call the principle of need to know. Does every employee need to have access to every file and document in your computer system? Probably not. You need to build sort of containers within those environments so that you mitigate the likelihood that you can just gain complete access to an environment. So that's, for example, if within our firm, I may have access to dedicated files that I work on, but I won't have access to the files that our insurance litigators are handling, or that our securities litigators are handling, or that our corporate real estate team is handling. We build in those privilege restrictions so that if my credentials are compromised, you just can't tunnel in and see everything. In terms of record retention and secure disposal, only keep information for however long you need it. And again, these are very sort of self-evident, obvious practice pointers, but they typically do not get implemented. In terms of secure disposal, we handled a case once where an insurance company was moving offices, and they just threw some hard drives into a dumpster out back of the office. And somebody actually went dumpster diving. This is a livelihood for some. And they grabbed the hard drives, and on the hard drives were spreadsheets containing the personal information of thousands of customers. You don't do that effort. Just make the extra step and securely disclose information. Two-factor authentication. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but basically that is an out-of-band form. So let's say I want to log into my email remotely. I go online, I type in maynardcooper.com, I log into our email system, but before I can see my messages, I've got an application on here that I need to go to. I've got to authenticate it from a mobile device so that they know that it is me actually accessing the environment. Oftentimes, if there was one thing this year that I'd say would have prevented most breaches, it would have been two-factor authentication. Because if they have your password and they get into your system, then they can begin to access the information. But if they don't have your mobile device, then that restricts the ability, even if they compromise your credentials. And don't have your second form of authentication be your email. So if you're compromised, right, and then you have your authentication in your email, then they're already in your environment, they can authenticate on your behalf. In terms of encryption, if you're emailing things out, it's always best to use Proofpoint or some other similar technology so that if you're emailing out a document that contains sensitive information, it has it. In terms of laptops, it's always best to encrypt them. These are not high-dollar initiatives to protect that information. In terms of backups, it's always best to have that information in a standalone center so that if you do get that ransomware note, you can restore your information rather than having to pay the demand. All right, so enough of the tech talk. Call to action, be prepared. This is from the DOGA Best Practices for Victim Response. And it says a quick, effective response to cyber incidents can prove critical to minimizing the resulting harm and expediting recovery. The best time to plan such a response is now, before an incident occurs. Now, the term we use is an incident response plan. You do not need to have a fancy, in-depth plan. It's sort of like buying a car. You got the entire span of the market. You just need to have a car. And then the question is, how nice of a car do you want to have? And with incident response, there's some very basic things you need to have in place. But what this study has shown, and this is from the Ponemon Institute, on the right-hand side, I recognize this is difficult to see, particularly in the back. These are things you can do to mitigate the cost of a breach. And on the left-hand side are contributing factors to making breaches more expensive. And what you can see on the top right-hand side is that an incident response team is the single largest contributor to mitigating the financial cost of a breach. And I'll speak through the contributing factors that make them more expensive. So who are you going to call? And this isn't a shameless plug for me as outside counsel. You need to have somebody who understands cybersecurity on your team. Okay, so we talked about law enforcement earlier. You need to have that relationship in place, either you directly or through your outside advisor, so that you can place that phone call to recover your funds if they've been stolen. In terms of internal investigation, that is typically what we identify as a best practice. You want to have that investigation cloaked under the attorney-client privilege. And the reason for that is a lot of technical folks are frankly just too honest and candid about what happened. I've seen emails when I've been called in to help companies that, if we start doing an investigation, we'll say, well, if we only had that budget, we would have addressed this issue. Or we should have known better, this is how they got in. And so by inserting that process with the privilege, it insulates some of that candid discussion from disclosure. We'll talk through that in a little bit later. There are statutory data breach notification laws that require companies to notify impacted customers. There's a patchwork scheme across the 50 United States. Alabama was the last state to put in a data breach notification law. It went into effect June of this year. It imposes a requirement under certain circumstances to notify the Attorney General's office within 45 days. A customer notice, I'm sure many of you have been on the receiving end of a letter that sort of identifies your information has been compromised, and here's what you need to do. From a PR statement standpoint, messaging is incredibly important in terms of making sure you educate your customers about what's happened. Credit reporting agencies, there are requirements to notify TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian so that they can anticipate a large call volume tied to the breach so they don't get caught cold. With a cybersecurity consultant, you're going to likely need somebody to come in and support your team. If you don't have the bench in-house, you're going to want to retain a cybersecurity consultant who can come in, understand the intrusion, understand what happened, how long the information was compromised, what was stolen, what remediation measures do we need to put in to contain the breach so that this doesn't happen in the future. And then you typically are going to spin up some form of call support, depending on the large breach. So that's a very quick and dirty summary of what you typically do on breach response. So let's walk through a scenario. So we recently handled a breach of a retail restaurant, and they had been called by one of their local credit unions and said, hey, we're seeing a bunch of sort of unusual activity tied to our credit cards. And we've looked at our records and we've done an investigation. The common point of purchase, what's called a CPP, is your company. So they engaged us and we started looking into the suspicious activity. And we ultimately brought in an independent third party. Now, if you're in retail or in any other industry where you accept payment card, that is really its own animal when it comes to a data breach response. And there's certain companies I want to use when I've had a credit card intrusion or a credit card breach. And the reason for that is, some of you may know this, but the credit card brands, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, Visa, if the intrusion is big enough, they will actually require you as the merchant to hire a payment forensic investigator, and it's on your dime. Whenever you see a credit card breach, the merchant is ultimately going to be responsible. Not your payment integrator, not your payment processor, not the card brands. You, the merchant, because that's the way the agreements are written. They pass down all of that risk to the merchant. And so, knowing that I'm representing a restaurant chain, and knowing the volume of transactions that they have, I'm thinking ahead to, there's the risk that if this is big enough and bad enough, the card brands are going to require my client to hire a payment forensic investigator. So what we do proactively is we hire one of the companies that has been certified by the card brands, so that if we need to address that issue, I've got somebody on my team who understands the card brand expectations, and hopefully we can sell them on our analysis and investigation without having to go out of pocket for another company, because that was what it would require. So we hired that company. Now the problem was, when we came to learn, is that the intrusion was not on my client's systems. It was on a vendor's systems. So that exacerbates the problem, because now I've got an issue with a vendor that's outside of my control. I don't have real-time access to the systems. And so you now need to manage that relationship, because you're ultimately dependent on them to help you understand the scope of the problem. And typically, as outside counsel, I'll sort of play it as it comes, but I'll typically try and stay behind the scenes, because as you would expect, when you hear there are lawyers involved, everybody sort of tends to tighten up and not be as candid, and I need their cooperation to get to the bottom of the intrusion. So we did the analysis, and we ultimately came to find that one of our vendors had been compromised. They were able to access their payment card systems over the internet. They were able to identify a vulnerability in the software. There was no authentication to use that access. So if you had the password, you were good. And we came to learn that they had been in the environment for about 6 months. And then we came to learn the pain point. 500,000 cards had been stolen. So now we've got to roll up, okay, how are we going to handle this? And these are the things you want to be thinking about proactively as opposed to being in the fire drill. I tell a lot of my clients, we require our kids to go through drills at school, fire drills and sadly now shooting drills. They practice those things every year in the school system. The same thing needs to be with the company. You have got to practice what if. What if this happens to us? Because the likelihood is that to some degree, and hopefully you're on the lower end of the spectrum, you will have a cybersecurity incident that leads to the loss of your money or the loss of your data. And how are you going to handle it? Because you want to be able to manage that to the best of your ability. So once we find out that 500,000 cards have been stolen, now we've got to address how do we respond. Now, from experience, you don't want to necessarily tell your customers what's happened until you can tell them, we've fixed it, here's what we've done, here's how we're protecting you, here are the services we're offering. Now, all of that's got to happen incredibly quickly because you don't want to sit on information. You don't want to be the Equifax where you know something for 6 weeks and you fail to tell your customers. So you want to be able, you have to execute all of that incredibly quickly. So you've got to have partnerships in place so that if you don't have the manpower to handle it internally, you've got external resources, a call center that can take your customers' calls and concerns. Okay? Here are the services we're going to offer. Understanding the price point, understanding the delivery mechanism for those services, and then messaging so that you understand, okay, how are we as an organization going to handle the response? What are the escalation points internally so that if we have a really mad customer, we know that touch point within our organization. So those are the things you need to think through proactively so you're not drilling with them reactively. So I spoke through this issue just specifically through the example, but this is becoming more and more common. I mean, I'm sure if I asked for a show of hands, nearly everyone in the room would acknowledge they have a vendor relationship. There's somewhere in the supply chain that we rely on a vendor to deliver services. And you need to think through, who are those vendors? What access to information do they have? Do they store my information, or do they have access to my systems? Because more often than not, we will find that the vendor is the contributing cause of the breach. Because again, if I'm a cyber criminal, I'm going after technology, not people. I'm going for the biggest source that has the biggest gain for me as a criminal, okay? And in that instance, I'd rather go to one vendor that services 1,000 companies than try and hit each of those companies. Because if I can figure out that one vendor, I've got 1,000 fish to catch. And that's how they think. And so you become incredibly dependent on those relationships. And it becomes harder because you don't necessarily have a direct line with them once the problem hits. So what do? These are typical questions you'll want to know if you've had a vendor breach. What information has been placed at risk? What evidence do you need to obtain from the vendor? How are they going to fix it? Who are you going to interact with? Are they going to notify impacted individuals, or are you going to notify impacted individuals? Do I have to terminate the relationship? Can I do that? And do I even have plan B on the horizon so that I could actually move that vendor relationship over to a new vendor and have a seamless transition from a customer-facing or operational standpoint? These are sort of those practical day-to-day questions that you need to ask yourselves. So what do you do about it? One thing you can do is look at the contract, okay? And what I have found is that these contracts are not written to address cybersecurity risk. I had a client 2 or 3 years ago call me on a Friday in March, and they said, JT, we got a problem. I said, what's going on? He said, one of my compliance officers just came to me, and every single one of our patients' medical records are available on Google. I can do a search for JT Malatesta, and our entire every one of your patient records can be seen right now. How do we handle that? Whatever scenario could impact your business, think about that proactively, not reactively, so you're not going through a fire drill. The point on this is when we did the investigation, we had found that it was a mom and pop vendor that had led to the breach, and that they were responsible for uploading and managing our web servers, and they had inadvertently connected a certain file share to the web server so that it was public facing. And these were incredibly sensitive records about patients. So how do you deal with that situation? Two pieces of advice. One, when you're in the trenches and you're trying to get through that security breach, don't worry about liability with that vendor. Easier said than done, but you are going to need that relationship to carry you through the investigation. Deal with the relationship on the back end, because if you just terminate it and cut it off right then and there, so too does your access to information. And that creates additional risk in terms of your customer relationships. So what you can do proactively, though, is look at the contract and say, okay, how do I deal with this in terms of the actual sort of terms and conditions of the relationship? So in terms of indemnification, so when we went to look at the vendor contract, what we came to see is that it only contemplated a indemnification for a third-party claim. So that would be if a patient, in this example, actually sues the healthcare facility, okay? It didn't address what we call first-party indemnification, which are the costs we as a company would incur if there's a breach. So what you want to do is make sure that your vendor, if they're responsible, has a financial obligation to pay all of your costs if you sustain a breach. Number two, limitation of liability. So oftentimes you'll see in a vendor contract that your limitation of liability is not to exceed what you have paid that vendor over the last 12 months. That can be 50 cents in a cup of coffee on a data breach. It's not going to hold a lot of value. It's just going to have really no more value than the paper it's written on. You need to be able to have the ability to recover more than that sum, because that might be $25,000 and your exposure is $250,000. You may want to outline some minimum baseline information security requirements that were sort of along the lines of what I talked through earlier. You want to talk through data breach notification. Who's going to notify impacted customers? Is it going to be us, the company, or you, the vendor? That is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all response. In certain instances, I've advised my company or my clients to go ahead and own that customer obligation, own the relationship, and go ahead and notify. In other instances, I've said, you actually would be better served by the vendor notifying, because then your customers will clearly understand it was the vendor's fault. And you can displace some of the litigation risk, because most plaintiffs' lawyers are going to sue the company that provides notice. You may say, well, look, my vendor's Amazon. They're the 800-pound gorilla. I can't negotiate terms and conditions, and that may very well be the case. So what do you do there? I think you want to think through insurance and be aware of the abilities. Okay, can I transfer this risk so that if we do have a cybersecurity incident or my vendor has a cybersecurity incident, I've got a cyber liability policy that covers us. And that's something you need to discuss with your broker as to what's the right amount of coverage that you need and what premium are you willing to pay. And so you want to think through those options. You can mandate that your vendor carry insurance coverage and you become an additional insured. That's one way to handle it. Another instance is, and this may surprise some in the audience, on your actual cyber liability and policy, the policy is written such that it will cover acts and omissions of your vendors. And so you can get that coverage through your own policy. All right. Lesson 8, risk assessments and data breach investigation should be shielded by the attorney-client privilege. So notwithstanding what our President of the United States has said, the attorney-client privilege is not dead, at least not in the context of my line of work. And what we have found is that insulating internal investigations in the wake of a cybersecurity incident can be cloaked in the attorney-client privilege, and it's been affirmed by the courts. So in the Target case, which was probably the first mega breach to really be tested in the judicial system, The plaintiff's lawyers actually tested the ability to gain access to the target's internal investigation when they had their Christmas breach in 2013. And what the district court overseeing that litigation said is that Target's internal investigation was privileged and was not accessible to the plaintiff's attorneys. And that is an incredibly important legal point that we continue to emphasize with our clients. If we can cloak the internal discussions around the internal investigation in privilege, it will serve your company well. Because too often is the case is I'm brought in 30 days after something's happened, 60 days after something, even a week after it's happened. And by that point, there's been a whole lot of chatter within the company about what happened, what are we going to do about it, are we at fault, and IT personnel tend to be brutally honest in sort of their internal documentation around those incidents. But if we can insert the attorney-client privilege at the inception of that, we can cloak all of that in the privilege, and we can contain that from downstream disclosure to regulators and plaintiff's lawyers if there's litigation. And that's not to say that the facts aren't going to come out, but you can control the types of documents that are disclosed in order to satisfy those requests. One other point I got to mention here. So in addition to the data breach investigation, if I was to sort of look at 2018 trends within my line of work, what I would say is more and more companies are doing proactive cybersecurity risk assessments. And what that means is we'll hire a cybersecurity consultant, and they'll look, just like David does on the bank side, we will look at your company, a holistic assessment of what tools and technologies are you using, what assets do you maintain, how are you protecting them, what are you going to do if those are compromised. And those assessments also are being done under the attorney-client privilege. And the reason is if you think downstream, okay, you're going to have a document that says, here are all the things that we're doing well, here are all of our gaps, here are the things that we need to do. And if you have a breach, and the reason for the breach is one of those gaps, that's a plaintiff's lawyer's dream, right? That's basically what I call strict liability. And so, no good deed goes unpunished, right? You're trying to assess your environment, you're trying to understand where is our exposure, how can we protect our information better, where should we invest our resources in our budget. And so in those instances, we too will assert the privilege over those in order to try and protect those findings from downstream use. All right, lesson number 9, executives and boards of directors are expected to take an active role in cybersecurity risk management. So, what many have realized, and there's been a lot of regulatory pressure, is that cybersecurity needs to be taken out of the server room and put into the boardroom. No longer can leadership just entrust this role and responsibility to its IT organization or say, you know what, we outsource it to this company, check the box, let me focus on day-to-day operations. There's an expectation from regulators that the board of directors is going to actively oversee how is a company managing this risk. It's become an isolated risk center. It's just like liquidity risk, it's just like credit risk or ops risk. Cybersecurity is now recognized as a standalone risk to organizations, and the expectation from consumers and from regulators is that you actually are going to oversee how are we addressing this risk center in our organization. Now, board members may say, well, we're not qualified to address that. I don't have the skill set. And that's understandable, but you also are a savvy businessman, and you understand the risks that can face that organization. So you can accomplish this in a couple of different ways. You can have internal presentations from management to the board. You can have external consultants, advisors, lawyers, educate the board. But what the regulators want to see and what plaintiffs' lawyers will test is, was the board being actively informed? And there have been some shareholder derivative lawsuits brought against management. And in those instances, the courts immediately look to how informed was the board? Was this an issue that they were taking up on a routine basis? It's not something that needs to be done every meeting. It's something that should be done periodically. Depending on your risk profile and your industry sector, that may be quarterly, it may be annually. But the point is that the board can't go ostrich in the sand on cybersecurity risk. It's got to think through, is this issue being addressed? And that may be talking to IT in an isolated discussion and saying, look, I want to shoot straight with me. Do you have the resources in your team? Do you have the budget to manage this risk? What are we doing well, and what do we need to do better? Those are the kinds of questions that you as a board member, even if you don't know anything about cybersecurity, can address. And you've got to foster that relationship and foster that understanding. And these are just a number of various statements. I mean, if you look at any regulator, alphabet soup, SEC, FINRA, FTC, I mean, pick your acronym, they're all going to have made a statement along these lines. All right, now, one interesting thing that I've seen is that companies are trying to use security as a market differentiator. They're trying to say, take two banks, Bank A and Bank B. Bank A, they say, you know what? We can create a differentiator in the marketplace by promoting our security and how we safeguard information, so that a customer choosing between Bank A and Bank B would say, you know what? All things being equal, I'm going to go to the company that takes care of my information. Careful about what you say in this regard. And that's really sort of the takeaway, is that the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, we have learned over the last 2 years, is now in the data security game. They view it as their obligation to ensure that companies are practicing what they preach. And they have chased companies that have said one thing and done another. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through both examples. But I want to show you this one, which is in matter of Dwala, which was a payment processor. And the interesting thing is that in this case, the CFPB didn't have there was no data breach that led to the investigation. Oftentimes, your regulator will come in if there's been a disclosed breach. In this case, they didn't. They said, we just looked at your website, and you said all information is securely encrypted and stored. All. 100% of your info is encrypted and stored securely. We use industry standard encryption technology. We are PCI compliant. And what the regulator did is they opened an investigation, and they found that this company did not do those things. They said one thing and they did another. They oversold their security, and what it led to is a 5-year consent decree and a $100,000 fine. In Wyndham, which is the hotel chain, and I'm not going to walk through that entire fact pattern because it'll take me probably 10 minutes to tell it. But at the end of the day, what you need to know is they were subjected to a 20-year consent decree. So now I've got the government looking over my shoulder every year and requiring annual audits to make sure that I am discharging my obligations toward consumers and say, this is what we say, and it's also what we do. All right, so in terms of the threat landscape, in terms of sort of to recap, I think the takeaway is that you need to be prepared, and you need to think through these issues proactively. Don't think of this as, okay, we're a small company, we're not going to be targeted, because the studies have shown that cybersecurity criminals are not necessarily going after the most wealthy or rich companies. They're going after the unprepared. They're looking to, how can I monetize this information? A lot of ransomware demands are $20,000 or less. They're in the habit of hitting as many different targets as they can with the hope that they pay. And so you've got to be prepared and think through these issues proactively. What I tell my clients is, if you had a breach today, could you respond within a week? And that is an incredibly ambitious deadline, but it's a realistic one. You've got to understand who within your team as an organization would handle it, what resources do we need, and how are we mitigating that risk? So I'm happy to take any questions or visit with you afterwards. I appreciate your time. I hope it's been helpful, and thank you.